When doing my analysis of magic circles in the video games Fire Emblem and Hades, I stumbled upon an interesting parallel between these favorite relaxation games of mine. They both take inspiration from tarot. This made me realize two things. One, I want to know more about tarot, and two, I know almost nothing about tarot. If you're like me, you thought of tarot cards as that one fortune-telling deck. They've got fancy pictures on it, 1,000 variations, some of them with fancy names and histories that stretch back to some point in history, at least to the Renaissance. Because of an art history research assignment I had at university, I was acquainted with the Solabuska deck, one of those fancy names, and I've heard of readings and glanced at some friends' fancy decks, but that's about it. I wanted some more basic familiarity with the tarot, in the same way I wanted to be more acquainted with magic circles, which led to my video overviewing their history. If I pick up a deck, I want to be equipped with some basic literacy, something that lets me look through the cards and say more than, ooh, that's a pretty picture. I want timelines, charts, historical perspective, pictures, etc. Something that would give me an overall grasp of what this thing is called tarot, and what I can look for if I examine decks in the future. This video is a result of my investigation. I will divide my video essay into a couple segments. First, I'll establish a broad timeline of the history of playing cards and suits leading up to the development of the specific kinds of decks we call tarot. Second, I'll overview the big ideas explored by the creators and interpreters of tarot from antiquity to modernity, to inform my understanding of the Renaissance decks in particular. Third, I'll lay out a timeline of tarot's development from a Renaissance-era card game to an occult tool for divination. After that, I'll provide some concluding thoughts on tarot, what I learned along the way, and things I will look for when examining decks in the future. Included in the video description will be a link to the timelines, charts, and some resources that you are free to add to your notes if you want to explore anything further. Do with this video and my notes as you will. Alright, let's dive into some timelines of tarot. First, to understand the tarot, we'll need to go farther back than the first tarot deck itself, as the playing cards in existence at that point had such a rich history that it wouldn't feel like their beginning. Not any more than the start of the final movie of a trilogy is a beginning if you haven't seen the two preceding films. To really grasp what the tarot is, we have to look back toward the beginning of playing cards themselves. And that takes us back to China. Playing cards most likely developed sometime in the 9th century toward the end of the Tang Dynasty. In 868 we get references to a game, Yezige, the Rules, or the Game of Leaves, being played by Princess Tong Chang with members of the Wei clan. Now, this is a disputed beginning. The rules of the Leaf game are lost to us. Some have taken the word leaves to refer to an early precursor of playing cards, but there's also precedent of the term referencing pages of a book used in a dice game. We don't know that Yezi was used to refer specifically to playing cards until the 15th century. But it is extremely likely that later cards derived from Chinese sources, and the earliest extant sources we have for things like cards, games, rules, or suits reveal stories and complexities that suggest much earlier dates than our earliest attestations. While suited paper cards might not date back to the 9th century, it seems like the idea of using cards or slips of paper as part of drinking games did. There are two other elements that seem to have originated in China too. The first element is the card's suit. Suits are categories containing several what we call pips, or symbols. I found conflicting sources on what the early Chinese suits were, but here's what I've been able to gather regarding Chinese suits. First, you have coins, later called cookies. These were 9 pips in reverse order. 1 is high, 9 is low. Similarly, you would have strings of coins. Coins with little holes in the center strung together. And again, 9 is low, 1 is high. Usually I would see the term myriads to refer to a third suit. This is myriads of strings, but I've also seen hundreds of strings being used as a term. And then in earlier games you would get a fourth suit, tens of myriads. These suits would appear on Chinese money cards, that is, playing cards based on units of currency, and the last two suits would feature heroes from the classic Chinese novel called Water Margin. These cards were employed in various games like Ma Diao, Ten Jiu, and Kanhu, and possibly they would go as far back as Yezige. Many Chinese card games employed gambling and the second element that seems to have originated in China, trick-taking, which is when everyone plays a card and the collection, called a trick, is taken by the highest card of the first suit played. Think the modern game Bridge. While money cards can only only be attested as far back as the 16th century, the game Ma Diao, employing suits and tricks, can be traced as far back as the 13th century. Chinese use of dominoes, with two suits, the military and the civil suits, date as far back as the 12th century. But one of the biggest evidences of earlier development is that these elements, trick-taking and suits, exist in cards and card games we'll look at next in the Middle East and in Europe. Many cards even retain the reverse ordering of the pips in the coins and the strings suits. Game historian John McLeod says that Eastern and Western card games must at the very least share a common origin, as the idea that both systems independently developed these intricacies stretches credulity. What seems most probable is this. Ideas like trick-taking and suits with their pips, heroes, and forward or backward orders developed before our earliest extant attestations. With the development of paper money in China toward the end of the 11th century, these cultural artifacts, both the material and the art and games for which they were employed, spread during the 11th and 12th centuries to India and the Middle East. Ganjifa, which seems to be a mix of Persian and Chinese for something meaning playing cards having to do with treasure, was a trick-taking game popular in India and Iran. By some rules played similarly to modern trick-taking games, though without a trump suit that beats all, or even an obligation to follow the lead card's suit. Yet again, I have found conflicting information, probably because the game has existed for centuries and been played with many variations, but the decks look something like this. You have usually 48, but sometimes 52 cards divided into 4 suits. You have coins, which like the Chinese coin suit are in reverse order. You have clubs or polo sticks, which are also in reverse order. It's also worth noting that this particular suit is both the result and instigator of confusion. It is thought to have derived from a misinterpretation of the picture of Chinese coins strung together, looking stick-like or club-like in appearance. And then later, the image of a polo stick would again be misinterpreted in Europe. Polo was huge in Islamic culture, but it would remain relatively obscure in Europe until brought back from India by the British in the 19th century. Third, you would have jugs or cups, which are thought to have derived from the Chinese character for the myriads suit turned upside down. The word for cups in Turkic, Tuman, even means myriad. And fourth, you would have swords or scimitars, which are also thought to derive from the Chinese character for the tens of myriads suit. Some sources say that Ganjifa was played with 2 court cards, a king and a vizier. Others say that there were 3 court cards for each suit, a king, a viceroy, and a second viceroy, which would bring the total of 52 cards, alongside the pips numbered 1 through 10 or 10 through 1. While the earliest written reference to Ganjifa dates to the 15th century, the earliest surviving card fragments could date as far back as the 12th century, which would make it one of the earliest artifacts from the Far Eastern game being played on the opposite side of the continent. But the game was far from set at this time. Cards could be circular or rectangular, and the shape had become thinner, wider, and taller than their predecessors. Lavish sets were made in the Mughal court out of ivory, tortoiseshells, and precious stones, with cheaper sets made for the masses out of wood, palm leaves, or stiffened cloth. As popularity of the game spread through the 13th century, it reached the Mamluk Sultanate in modern-day Egypt and Western Arabia during a period of relative prosperity and stability. Artists built upon the Persian model, creating abstract and calligraphic works of art. Remember the proscription against depicting people in Sunni Islam. To this day, we have a nearly complete set of 47 Mamluk playing cards dating to the 15th century. The Mamluks retained the 4 suits, coins and polo sticks in reverse order, cups and swords in numerical order, and their 52 card decks had 3 court cards. They had a Malik, a king, a Naib Malik, which would be a viceroy or a deputy king, and a Thani Naib, a second or an under-deputy. Interestingly, this last rank didn't actually exist, a hint that the card reflects its heritage rather than any actual Mamluk leadership. Evidence of playing cards in Europe first starts to trickle in not through surviving artifacts or descriptions of how to play the game, but from prohibitions of card games. The earliest dates to 1367, a ban on card games in Bern, Switzerland, and more bans follow. A decade later in Florence, England in 1413, there's a fun hint of playing cards in Spain from a rhyming dictionary that includes the word naip, playing card, deriving from the 2 deputy court cards in the Mamluk deck. This cute little inclusion both suggests the popularity of the term as well as the connection between the European playing cards and their Mamluk origin. A 1377 treatise by the Dominican friar John of Rheinfelden gives us a glimpse into what these 14th century European cards might have looked like. He describes a 4x13 sheet, which might hint at the same number of pips and courts, but he also talks about cards like a king, Ober and Unter, which would be marshals, maids, and queens. While he cannot condone the gambling acts that likely led to all the aforementioned banning, he is moved by the idea that cards could be used as a way to understand and explain the world. The figures could, with a basic description, become instructive about the figures' corresponding functions at court, and this potential for teaching would expand as the cards came to include gods, heroes, and saints in later years. Not to get too ahead of myself, but some 16th century German decks would also contain illustrations and written instructions about music, arithmetic, and astronomy. New suits flourished as Europeans reinterpreted and reimagined the cards. In Italy, the curved scimitar was maintained for the sword suit, which accompanied coins and cups, while the polo stick was called a club or a wand. Spain maintained the 4 Mamluk suits, swords, coins, clubs, and cups, but their sword was straightened. Portugal followed suit, no pun intended, but sometimes added dragons to the aces. Switzerland and Germany departed from the custom, with Germany eventually settling on leaves, bells, acorns, and hearts, while Switzerland settled on shields, bells, acorns, and roses, or flowers. Other suit innovations across Europe included bears, hares, parrots, lions, deer, and wild men. The 15th century Flemish hunting deck is so named because of its suits representing aspects of a royal hunt: hound collars, hound tethers, game nooses, and hunting horns. If you, like me, grew up with spades, diamonds, clubs, and hearts, you can thank France and England for adopting these suits. There's some dispute regarding their origin, but the disputes revolve around a common theme. One legend holds that hearts stood for clergy, spades for the lance points of knights, diamonds for arrowheads representing vassals, and clubs for clovers representing peasants. In 1704, this French historian, whose name I'm too tired to try to pronounce, wrote something similar, that the suits represented the 4 classes of medieval society: hearts for clergy, spades for nobles, clubs for merchants, and diamonds, which were considered a floor tile, for peasants. Tarot historian Ronald Decker connected a French divination theme for a 4-suited deck to both the French suits and the Italian. Here's a chart showing the connection from the Italian suits to the French and English suits, to the classes of medieval society, and on to the divinatory themes. You know what? I'm feeling generous. Here's a chart with all the suits we've talked about this whole video so far, delineated so you can see the likely progression of suits over time and distance. Though note that the diamonds are associated with the coin lineage and clubs with the, well, club lineage. Decker swapped these as they make classes and divinatory themes make sense, but they don't follow the extended lineage as cleanly. I've also put a bolder box around what are called the Latin suits, as they'll be relevant to tarot, which I promise we will be getting to at some point. Again, all these charts are in the video description, do with them what you will. Alright, moving along. As nice as it is to think of these cards as pretty works of art with instructional potential, they were by far used as a means of gameplay, usually with gambling, as the prohibitions emphasize. Games had a myriad, again no pun intended, of variations, but in general you'd have trick-taking games wherein a player would play a card, and subsequent players would play a card of the same suit if they were able. Whoever played the highest card won the trick. Sometimes though, you'd have one suit set aside as what's called a trump suit, which automatically beats all other suits. Play the highest trump card and you win the trick. But sometime in the early 15th century, you started getting innovations on this idea of trumps and trick-taking. Card designers were building a 5th kind of suit, a dedicated trump suit, adding a little twist to the game. It's hard to pin down an exact date, especially since the definition of what constitutes a suit is fairly ambiguous. For example, around the year 1420, you have this astrologer, Marziano da Totona, who designed a deck for one Duke Filippo Maria Visconti of Milan. Visconti? Wonder if that name's going to come up again. Foreshadowing. This new deck included 16 new cards depicting gods from classical antiquity. The gods acted as trumps, but it isn't really a trump suit. The 16 cards were divided into 4 cards for each suit. By the 1440s, though, we have sure evidence of decks that have a 5th dedicated trump suit. A 1440 Florentine court record documents the transfer of 2 decks to one Sigismondo Pandolfo Malatesta, the first recorded use of the word trionfi referring to a trump suit. These were the carte dei trionfi, also referred to simply as trionfi, the triumph, or the trump cards. And yes, those 2 words are related. Triumph comes from the Latin triumphus, an achievement or a success, or even a celebratory procession, and trump is a corruption of triumph. That sounds like a political statement, but no, I'm just talking etymology here. There was a slight problem with these decks called Trionfi. The word triumph or trump was already used across multiple decks and games, which led to some confusion. A game called Trionfa, for example, was becoming popular in the 16th century. As early as 1502, the word tarocco appeared as an alternative name in Brescia, Italy. This direction seems to have won out, with the word tarocchi, tarot in English, becoming the name of the older game. Tarot, then, refers specifically to decks which employ a fifth suit dedicated to being a trump or a triumph suit. And this, for some reason, surprised me. I knew that tarot had a fifth suit going in, but the art that decorated all the cards felt so much more defining to me, as did the divinatory element. While those might be strong correlations with the idea of tarot today, the art and the divination, it was simply the fifth suit that distinguished tarot from its alternatives in the 15th and 16th centuries. And why the words tarocchi or tarot, you might ask? Well, whether or not you're asking, I'm going to answer the question, because it turns out to be a fun one, so we don't actually know what the etymology of tarot is, but boy, you can bet that people have been eager to assert their ideas. A lot of them are fun, silly nonsense. You have some eager occultists that have connected the word tarot to the goddess Ashtoreth, not to be confused with the demon Astaroth. The connection between their names only looks possible in some languages, and it falls apart on the slightest inspection. Two occultists that we'll look at more closely later on had their own ideas. Coeur de Gébelin claimed that the word comes from two Egyptian words, Tar and Ra or Ro, meaning royal road. The problem with this is, of course, that he was asserting this before Europeans had any idea how hieroglyphs or Egyptian worked. Put another way, he was just making it up. A follower of his, Comte de Molay, claimed that the word tarot came from the Egyptian Tar-Rosh, which he believed referred to a doctrine of the god Thoth. We'll talk more about Thoth later, but you can probably figure out what's wrong with his assertion. I'll give you a hint. He's closer to describing the origin of Yu-Gi-Oh! Than tarot. More plausible etymologies are debated. The word might come from the Taro River in northern Italy. The river powered mills to make paper, so perhaps the region was known for card making. Tarok was a term used as a synonym for foolishness around the same time the game acquired this name in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, so maybe that explains its origin. It's also been noted that singular tarocco in modern Italian is the cultivar of a blood orange. Alternatively, it and the verb taroccare are used some places to indicate that something is fake or forged. These meanings, though, likely derive from the card game, not the other way around. So we're left wondering what the etymology of tarot is. Whatever the meaning, we have finally arrived at the existence of tarot, a collection of cards first made in the 1440s in Italy, including a minor arcana, I'll get to that term later, that has 4 suits of pips and court cards, and a major arcana comprising a 5th dedicated trump suit. The 4 suits of the minor arcana might appear strange to someone like me who grew up with the French suit system and 3 court cards, a king, queen, and jack, but in context, the use of the suits coins, clubs, cups, and swords seems quite natural. A modern viewer might look at the court cards of a tarot deck and be surprised to find a knight, but it's actually the queen that was the surprise intruder. There was a 1441 Milanese deck that had 6 court cards, which might account for the queen's inclusion in the tarot. You had your 3 customary cards, a king, a knight, and a page or a jack, but each of them had a female counterpart. The king and the queen were both seated as royals. A knight and a dame were both mounted, and a page and a maid were both standing. It's been hypothesized that this Milanese deck was made for some lady of a court due to the card's inclusions, and that the tarot removed the dame and the maid, so they were removing cards, not adding a queen. But what comprises the major arcana? Well, it depends on when and where. While the rules of tricks have not changed significantly since the 15th century, the cards that comprise a tarot deck varied over time and distance. Let's talk about the decks themselves. The oldest extant tarot cards we have total 271 cards from 15 fragmented decks painted around the 1450s for the Visconti Sforza family ruling in Milan. While we won't go over every single known deck, there are lots of them, many lost or extinct, I do want to overview some of the famous big names. And a note on these names, Italians tend to refer to the decks by their last Italian owner, while Americans name them after the museum or the collection that keeps the decks, so sometimes there are discrepancies parentheses in the deck names. Visconti Sforza is the umbrella name for the family of the oldest tarot decks, all dating to the mid-15th century. Hey, the aforementioned Duke Visconti of Milan is back. The name Visconti Sforza can refer collectively to any of the 3 following decks, all of which have had disputes about the year of their creation and which is the oldest of the 3. The current theory is that the Brera Brambilla deck is the oldest, the Carriale, or the Visconti di Modrone, is the weirdest deck, and the Pierpont Morgan Bergamo is the most complete of the 3. Stepping back to the Carriale, why is it weird? Well, it has the 6 court cards I mentioned earlier, the King, Queen, Knight, Dame, Page, and Maid. It also has 3 Christian virtue cards, Faith, Hope, and Charity, inclusions that other decks do not have. That said, the Carriale is not the only unique assortment of cards. The Solabusca, dating to the late 15th century, was the first, and for a long time the only deck to have fully illustrated pips decorated with characters interacting with the correct number of items according to their suit. It also has a series of trumps based on classical characters, something apparently common in Ferrara, and which spread to France in the 16th century. Perhaps it was due to this classical assortment that the Solabusca numbered their trumps. Other decks thought their trumps numbering was intuitive, and we'll talk about that more later. Another strange deck, the Rosenwald Tarot, made around 1500 in Florence, numbered 11 of their trumps, but not the rest, and they fused 2 of their common trump cards, the Fool and the Magician, leaving them with 21 trumps instead of the customary 22. And then there's the Minchiate, made sometime in the late 15th century, but with its earliest mention in 1506 Florence. It has 97 cards, with several extra trumps, including the 3 Christian virtues that were in the Carriale, all 4 cardinal virtues, we'll talk about that in a moment, 12 cards for the zodiac, and the 4 classical elements, fire, water, earth, and air. The Minchiate deck is by far the most inclusive and extensive of the major arcana. But the more customary deck, whose trumps and numbering became the standard by the 18th century, was the 16th century Tarot of Marseille, inspired by the Milanese Visconti arrangements. It was this deck that occultists from the 18th through the 20th centuries analyzed and built upon, leading to the 1781 redesign by Coeur de Gebelin, the 1789 Grand Italia, the 1889 Oswald Wirth Tarot made in Switzerland, ooh fancy, and the most popular deck today, the 1909 Waite-Smith deck, made in England. We'll talk about the occultists and their redesigns later. For now, let's look at this standard for the tarot, the trumps of the Tarot of Marseille. In order to understand the significance of the trumps, their identities, their sequence, and their meaning, we first have to zoom out and take a look at ideas being explored by European artists during the Renaissance. Before we dive into these Renaissance philosophies, let me tell you a story. It's called Blanquerna, one of the first European novels ever written, authored by the Catholic theologian and philosopher Ramon Lull around 1283. The romance novel centers around the eponymous hero Blanquerna, a young nobleman torn between 2 choices. First is the love of a young woman named Natana. When the 2 of them are alone, an opportunity orchestrated by their mothers, she quite boldly expresses her affection. And I quote, "For long, O Blanquerna, have I desired a way wherein I may speak to thee of that which is in my heart and reveal it. For long have I loved thee inwardly with all my soul, and above all things I desire to be thy wife." Oh, please don't quote me out of context. "If thou by virtue of thy lineage and wealth art deserving of a richer and more honorable wife, do thou consider the love wherewith from the depth of my heart I love thee, and may God fulfill the desire of my will to have sons of thee, who shall be servants of God, and be like unto thyself in the holy life which thou dost lead." Personally, I might not have jumped straight to, "Hi, I want to have your children," but hey, seize the day, Natana, I guess. The problem is the second choice, another love which Blanquerna harbors. Yes, we've got a love triangle here, but it's not what you think. The text says, "Fair was Natana, and prudently with a semblance of great love did she speak these words to Blanquerna, yet not cast from his heart was his holy desire, nor did the fire of the Holy Spirit, which had kindled in his whole soul, tarry long in coming to his aid. So, when Blanquerna had thought for a brief space on the words which Natana had spoken to him, he spake to her these words, The King of all kings, who in the hope and consolation of all sinners do I adore and bless, because from today temptations begin to assail me, and the divine virtue aids me against evil counsel. With the light of grace hath the Holy Spirit illumined my soul, making me to desire the life of a hermit, that I may have within my heart God alone. When thou, Natana, didst reveal to me thy heart, the lust of the flesh began to tempt my soul through my bodily nature and the work of the evil spirit. But forthwith my soul turned to the remembrance of its lover. God forgets not his servant, and his love makes me so greatly to despise thy words that I marvel as I follow thine arguments, how in one so fair as thou there can be so foolish a thought as this of thine, which counsels me to forsake the love of my sovereign Lord for the love of thee. Jeez, these characters do not hold back. What's wild to me is Natana doesn't get offended, but actually pushes harder to convince him. Think I might have let him go at this point. So, this man is torn between a worldly love and a divine love of wisdom and virtue, and he chooses the latter, committing to a life of religious devotion. Devotion and trials mark the stories of all the characters in the novel. His parents pass through trials related to the 7 deadly sins. Natana actually contemplates Blanquerna's words so much that she decides no man was made for her love besides Jesus Christ. She becomes a nun, much to her mother's distress, and ascends to the position of abbess, during which time she and the sisters she presides over experience trials related to the 7 virtues. The first 3 are known as the Christian virtues: faith, hope, and charity, what we mentioned earlier as being included in some decks like the Minchiate and the Carrie-Yale. The latter 4 are called the cardinal virtues: justice, prudence, fortitude or strength, and temperance. Blanquerna, meanwhile, follows female personifications of faith and truth on his journey through the wilderness. He meets other embodiments of abstract concepts, learning and meditating on his path to join a monastery. At one point, he even meets a knight who seeks wisdom in auguries and omens. Blanquerna treats him as a friend, but instructs him that God disapproves of such things, and the knight probably does as well. When asked whether the knight favors skill or luck, the knight of course says skill, but Blanquerna points out the absurd contradiction that this armored and experienced knight claims to trust skill, but then acts as though he favors fortune, seeking out omens. The knight thanks him for his sage counsel, and the two go on their way. Blanquerna, like Natana, finds that his virtue and intellect allow him to excel so much that he quickly rises from the position of monk to an abbot, then to a bishop, and eventually to becoming the Pope himself. Now, one might think that this would be the pinnacle of a life devoted to faith, but the papacy has its own temporal troubles. Entangled in politics and temptations, he finds himself longing to shrug off the world and embrace the life of a hermit. As a pope, he sees a wide array of people and places, from the wild to the bustling city, from thieves and prostitutes to young maidens and even to emperors. His life turns when he meets the emperor's jester, Ramon the Fool, and it is this fool who helps Blanquerna put the affairs of the church in order and find himself with the real option of stepping away. When Blanquerna reaches old age, he does just that. He sets out to become a hermit, searching for wisdom and enlightenment beyond what he could find in the church. That said, I feel it's worth noting that a hermit's life is not one of total isolation in this story. He receives a cell in an ancient church described as very comely. There's a nice fountain nearby and a house about a mile off where a man lived who made Blanquerna's food. Sounds like a nice life. I could be a hermit like that. Every day Blanquerna woke up at midnight to watch the stars and meditate. He'd sing mass, speak to the deacon, work in a garden, and find recreation in the mountains and plains where he'd read and write and think about life. Or, well, as the text puts it, meditating upon the honors of God and upon the sins which men commit in this world against him. I might skip that part of the otherwise very wonderful sounding retirement. But there are other hermits in and around Rome, and they're more prone to temptation than he is. One begs Blanquerna to write a book, and Blanquerna acquiesces, but he takes a surprising source of inspiration, one which the text is not shy about. It says, while Blanquerna considered after this manner, he remembered how that once when he was a pope, a Saracen related to him that the Saracens have certain religious men, and that among others are certain men called Sufis, who are the most prized among them, and these men have words of love and brief examples to give to men great devotion, and by the exposition thereof the understanding soars aloft, and the will likewise soars, and is increased in devotion. Inspired by Sufi poetry, he composes a book called The Book of the Friend, or the Lover, and the Beloved. It contains 365 love poems, one for every day of the year. This book within a book is offered as a mystical guide to contemplation, one which can steer the reader, sometimes called the lover, other times called the fool, in conversation with one referred to as his beloved, through a world of temporary passions to a higher, more exalted and truer love. Consider the elements of this medieval romance novel: a procession of characters including lovers, fools, emperors, popes, and embodiments of ideas like faith, virtue, and justice and temperance, Christian ideas woven in with knightly chivalry, and questions of mysticism and non-Christian philosophies, all revolving around questions of the soul, matters of will and devotion, contemplation of temporal and celestial love. This is the setting I want you to bear in mind as I overview the timeline of Renaissance ideas. These ideas are all concepts weighing on the minds and the hearts of artists and poets, the noblemen and the masses, and it's this context from which we receive the tarot as one of many artistic artifacts of the Renaissance. First, let's look at triumphs. I've mentioned processions twice now, once as a description of the cast of characters that parade by in Blanquerna, and once in the definition of triumph. Remember, the trump or triumph cards are so named not only because they trump preceding cards, that is, the higher card wins, but also because I Triumphi is literally meant to be a triumphal procession, a parade of characters. Triumphs date all the way back to ancient Rome. Etruscan artwork on sarcophagi and funeral urns from the 3rd and 4th centuries BCE depict a man in a chariot drawn by horses with others marching and playing music, as though the soul of the deceased were being escorted to the afterlife. In the Latin tradition, triumphs were arranged for a victorious general who would return as the culmination of a parade down the Via Appia, the Appian Way. The triumphs were arranged from those in the lowest rank to those in the highest, starting with the captives and ending with the general, each elevation through the ranks trumping those that came before. These triumphs were also held as religious processions before games or at Roman funerals. This was one of a number of elements of classical culture that captured the fascination of Europeans in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. In the 13th century, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II combined his infatuation with Romantic literature and the desire to reclaim glories of the past. Achieving victory over Milan in 1237, he played the part of a conquering hero in a reenactment of the triumphal procession in Rome. By the 14th century, triumphs had become a regular part of yearly festivals, with every major city through Italy having at least one per year. This popularity continued to grow in the Renaissance, celebrated during Carnival, and at weddings with masked and costume figures marching, singing, dancing, and riding in chariots. Renaissance artists and authors seized on these popular processions, in which each character triumphed over the one before. The triumph became a structure for allegories in which virtues trumped vices, and the victor could be anything from a hero to a mystical truth or a Christian virtue. Lull's 13th century Blanquerna acts as a precursor to the same kinds of poems and paintings we find in works like Petrarch's 14th century I Triumphi, or Pieter Bruegel's 16th century Triumph of Time. Ola's piece by Bruegel was described by the artist as his best work, quote, a picture in which truth triumphs. The famous Leonardo da Vinci even directed at least 2 triumphs in Milan, designing a colossal machine to represent the motion of planets, with singers costumed as the gods of each planet. Triumphs must have been quite the spectacle. Robert Place described the levels of excitement as comparable to Mardi Gras today. These processions reached their peak in the 15th century, right at the same time that tarot was developing, keeping in mind that Renaissance artists worked in a time of artistic experimentation, competition, and grand achievement, with a myriad of allusions to antiquity as well as their current culture. The triumph cards of a tarot deck start to make sense. While not uniform, each major arcana acts as a triumphal procession, one which may include characters good and bad, from fools to gods, Christian and classical and mystical allusions abounding. If you ever encounter a tarot deck and want to examine the cards as something more than some 78 individual pieces of art, consider looking at the major arcana in sequence. What triumphal story do you see? I'll take you on a bit of a triumphal tour myself at the end of this section, as it's the story of a triumph that helps helps me remember the sequence of trumps in the standard format as laid out in the Tarot of Marseille. But first I want to look a bit closer at those Christian, classical, and mystical allusions I mentioned earlier. What cultural influences besides the triumph influenced the Tarot's artwork? These philosophies were discussed and explored during the Renaissance, but different artists at different times have fixated on the following ideas to different degrees. Some of them became more of a focus for the 18th and 19th century occultists than they had been for the 15th century tarot artists, but all of them are the kinds of ideas that circled in the realm of the tarot's creation, and they are thus worthy of our familiarity. Let's go back to the 4th century BCE, particularly to the year 370, when the Greek philosopher Plato composed a dialogue called Phaedrus. Drawing from the ancient tradition of triumphs, here he compares the human soul to the, quote, natural union of a team of winged horses and their charioteer. One of the winged horses is dark, wild, and improperly trained, representing the unbridled appetites and desires of man. One horse is white, beautiful, and noble, representing the spirit, will, and emotion of man. The charioteer is the calculating driver of the two horses, representing man's capacity for reason. Everyone is said to have a chariot on a parallel plane of existence, which will carry them to the celestial abode of the gods after their mortal life, if they can make it there. Let your appetites take the reins, and the bad horse will send you crashing back down to earth. Plato, like Pythagoras, believed in reincarnation. Maybe you'll train your steeds better the next time around. But steer your chariot to the high ridge of heaven, and you will be able to gaze out at all that is beyond, beholding truths at the rim of reality. You might have detected a parallel between Phaedrus and Blanquerna, a man pulled between two forces, one worldly and the other spiritual. Aligned with the latter, and enlightenment awaits. This parallel is more striking if we look at Plato's Symposium, written sometime between 385 and 370 BCE. In one of the recorded extemporaneous speeches, we are presented with two Aphrodites, the goddess of love, but now she is presented as two different kinds of love. Sound familiar? One Aphrodite is called vulgar, or pandemos, worldly, ruler of sexuality and physical beauty. The other is still beautiful, but she represents a heavenly love, referred to as Urania. Let's set aside that Plato's idea of heavenly love is not remotely in line with what we might think of as heavenly love today. It involves pederasty. And let's focus instead on how Renaissance thinkers viewed Plato. Even if our modern concept of Christian love would have been unrelated to what we find in these two Aphrodites, the question of two loves, one worldly and the other representing a grander, more divine beauty, was very appealing to Christians and philosophers alike. These later thinkers contemplating and reimagining Plato are what today we would call Neoplatonists. It's a broad term encompassing Western philosophers from the 3rd all the way to the 15th centuries who tried to synthesize Plato's philosophies with various other ideas, mystical and religious. The classics, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Kabbalah, Sufi mysticism, Christian mysticism. The umbrella term Neoplatonism is less a set of ideas and more the act of putting all of these philosophies in conversation with each other. Porphyry was a notorious anti-Christian philosopher from late antiquity, and Renaissance philosophers like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola thought that they could synthesize Christianity and concepts we today would definitely call magical, even occult, and yet all three of these men were Neoplatonists. Ramon Lull, who authored the story of Blanquerna, also was a Neoplatonist. When hearkening back to classical thinkers like Plato and Pythagoras, Neoplatonists tended to focus more on the mystical philosophies of these men. In his History of the Tarot, Robert Place, for example, writes enthusiastically about Plato's questioning of how one conquers death and finds eternal life, about how Plato was concerned with a thing's essence, the archetypical concept. In Symposium, Plato's trying to arrive at the archetype, the essence of beauty, which is something beyond the vulgar, passionate love. Neoplatonists also harken back to Plato's Republic, written sometime around the year 375 BCE, which, though also a work of political philosophy, has a lot of these spiritual, mystical concepts intertwined with the political. Remember the three souls from the chariot metaphor, that of the appetite, the will, and the reason. Plato's Republic has 3 tiers of citizens who must engage in certain kinds of work to master their souls and rise through the ranks. The lowest tier comprises the lovers of gain, those governed by the soul of appetite. They need to learn temperance to achieve a balance of desires. Plato recommends that they study music, a discipline that requires constant effort to achieve harmony and appreciate balance. The middle tier comprises the lovers of honor, those governed by the soul of will. While entrusted with more authority, they might win glory, which can be dangerous for an untamed soul. They need to learn strength, fortitude, and courage to mitigate the influences of anger, cruelty, or abuse of power. Plato, interestingly, recommends the study of gymnastics, which included martial arts. They needed to learn strength of mind and body in order to rise. The highest tier comprises lovers of wisdom, those governed by the soul of reason. As leaders among men, they needed to learn prudence or wisdom to manage both logic and abstract notions. Plato recommends they study mathematics, which will teach them to conceptualize and understand abstract principles that underlie reality. A school that teaches music, gymnastics, and mathematics. Sounds interesting. Above them all rules one man called the Philosopher King, who has mastered all the virtues and who dedicates himself to the study of philosophy and contemplation of the divine. You might have noticed the 4 cardinal virtues showing up in Plato's Republic. Temperance, to elevate those governed by appetite; fortitude, to elevate those governed by will; prudence, to elevate those governed by reason; and justice being a composite of the 3 in balance, and the work of the Philosopher King. Look at the Major Arcana and you will see these virtues appearing in the procession, though usually you'll only find 3 of the 4, and not the 3 Plato employed as instruction to those seeking mastery of their souls. The reason for this is simple. A 13th century Dominican friar from Italy, Thomas Aquinas, swapped prudence and justice, naming wisdom as the virtuous composite of temperance, fortitude, and justice. As he wrote, "Prudence is absolutely the principle of all the virtues. The others are principle each in its own genus. The part of the soul which is rational by participation is threefold." Medieval Christians adopted this hierarchy of the virtues, combining with them the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and charity, giving us the 7 virtues contemplated by Renaissance artists and those who designed the tarot. These are the 7 virtues present in the extended Major Arcana of the Carriel Tarot. Both Plato and Neoplatonists drew from the teachings of Pythagoras too. Yes, that Pythagoras. He did more than give us a theorem. His meditations on what's called a tetractys show precursors to Plato's fascination with creation, the soul, and even math and music. This pyramid of 4 rows, which add up to the perfect number of dots, 10, was considered a sacred piece of geometry. Supposedly, his students would even swear oaths by it. So there you go. Next time someone asks if you promise, swear by the tetractys of Pythagoras that you promise, and they'll know you're sincere. Included in the sacred symbol are ideas of a mystical creation, from the 1 down to the 4 terrestrial elements. Pythagoras also saw geometric significance in the arrangement: 1 dot, a point; 2 a line; 3 a triangle, being the first polygon that can be formed; and 4 a tetrahedron, the first polyhedron that can be formed. He even saw musical scales in the relationship between the 4 tiers. There's a 1:2 ratio, a 2:3, and a 3:4 ratio, giving us the vibrations of the most important points on the musical scale: the whole note, the perfect 5th, and the perfect 4th, respectively. Add 4 notes to the 3 essentials and you get the diatonic scale of 7 notes, still in use today. An act of creation also associated with ancient astronomy. Pythagoras believed that each planet made music as it orbited the Earth, an idea I think is just charming. 1 note per planet, by ancient understanding of what a planet was. These were the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Porphyry claimed that Pythagoras taught that the 7 muses were the 7 planets singing together the 7 notes of the diatonic scale. Another great idea, but I'm not sure who his 7 muses were, since who the muses were and how many there were varied, but that's a video for another day. From this shape alone, we have both geometric and musical/astrological fundamentals, the creation of a physical and a celestial world. This is how the ancients played with ideas and patterns in their world, and it's no wonder such philosophizing captured the imaginations of later writers. Neoplatonists took these ideas and expanded on them. Contemplation of symbols and numbers ascending to higher planes, mastery of the soul to achieve achieve enlightenment and virtues that aid in the ascension. These are the essentials of Neoplatonism and of the tarot. To further understand the wealth of ideas entertained by Renaissance thinkers, let's look at a couple other big topics whose symbolism adds dimension to the tarot's creation. One of the greatest sources of late medieval and Renaissance inspiration, from artistic representations to actual practice, is a very broad category called Hermeticism. To summarize a complex assembly of ideas, all things Hermetic relate to ancient writings ascribed to a mythical figure called Hermes Trismegistus. This includes mystical philosophy, alchemy, astrology, and other magical practices embodied in 19 texts written in Alexandria sometime between the 1st century BCE and the 4th century CE, which we collectively refer to as the Hermetica, or the Corpus Hermeticum. So if you ever hear about Hermeticism or Hermetic magic, just think magic and religion in Egypt and the Middle East about 2,000 years ago. Now, it's more complicated than that. There are questions about how much is magic versus how much is religion or philosophy, what was actually practice versus what was just theory, how these writings are understood at later times and reimagined or misrepresented, and how much is historical versus legend. This Hermes Trismegistus, for example, didn't actually exist. Thoth was an Egyptian god with some parallels to the Greek god Hermes, such as their involvement with writing and magic. During the Hellenistic period, between the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE and the death of Cleopatra in 30 BCE, when Egypt was integrated with Greek culture following Alexander's conquests, Egyptians wrote in Greek. Thoth had been customarily graced with the honorific Great Great Great, three greats communicating this idea of eternal greatness. Sounds great. So in the Hellenistic period, Thoth's name was translated as Hermes, and the epithet was abbreviated to Trismegistus, literally meaning thrice great. Hellenistic schools of philosophy in Alexandria believed that their teachings were based on the ancient writings of Hermes Trismegistus. Such philosophies included ideas like the world being comprised of 4 elements with 4 qualities: hot, cold, moist, and dry. And these elements are kept from a constant state of chaotic flux through a 5th element, the anima mundi, or the world's soul, also known as the quinta essentia, giving us the English word quintessence. It was an idea influential across many ancient Greek and Roman philosophies: Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, Stoicism, Gnosticism. As I said when overviewing Neoplatonism, there's a lot of overlap of ideas here. Regarding these elements, there's an idea of correspondence, a symbolic connection between celestial and terrestrial forces. This is what gives us the Hermetic axiom you might have heard before: as above, so below. The idea of macrocosm and microcosm that came up in my video about magic circles, and which pervades ideas like alchemy and astrology. The planets are gods or angels alive and influencing matters in heaven and thus also on earth. The interconnectedness of elements can also lead to transformations. As lead can be turned to gold, so can a man be turned into a sage. During the Renaissance, the enlightenment one can achieve through the primeval wisdom of Hermeticism was called the Presca Theologiae, the ancient theology, one truth which survives in traces across many systems of thought. This idea of interconnectedness, the celestial and terrestrial, and transforming into something better, more enlightened, again sounds like Neoplatonism, and it will come up in later philosophies. Within this category of Hermeticism, there are 3 subfields that all explore this idea of correspondence or interconnectedness, as well as transformation and some kind of ascension. Let's briefly overview alchemy, astrology, and the Book of Thoth. Alchemy is an art or craft associated with attempts to purify and perfect materials. You take a base element, like lead, and convert it into something nobler, like gold. Its practice stretches back to the 1st century CE, and traditions have existed in Europe, the Middle East, India, and China, but it was the Greco-Roman practice that was reintroduced to Europe in the 12th century, as medieval Islamic works were translated by Muslims, Jews, and Christians into vulgar languages and Latin, capturing the fascination of European philosophers and clergy. For example, one of the most fundamental works is called the Emerald Tablet, supposedly written on emerald by Hermes Trismegistus. The text we have today is part of a larger work called The Secret of Creation, credited to the Islamic alchemist Al-Razi, written sometime around 813 to 833 CE. The magnum opus, or the great work of alchemy, was to create an elixir of immortality. the Philosopher's Stone as it was often called, which could cure any ailment, physical or spiritual. Such an item could be created out of what was called prime substance, something common and of unrecognized value, being elevated through alchemical principles until achieving this divine quintessential level. Alchemists even grouped their chemical processes into 7 main procedures that form a ladder of ascension, paralleling the Hermetic ladder of planets that also came up with Plato and Pythagoras. Saturn paralleled lead, the most impure of metals. Mars was associated with iron, Jupiter tin, Venus copper, Mercury, the moon silver, and the sun, of course, gold, the purest form of metal and associated with enlightenment. Speaking of planets, astrology is another broad umbrella term encompassing various practices that try to divine things about the world, past, present, or future, from reading the heavens. This practice stretches back some 4,000 years at least, and it has been applied in some form in cultures all over the world. But during the Renaissance, it was studied in the same circle of Hermetics who studied alchemy. Of particular interest to astrologers is the zodiac, the region of the sky that contains the brightest planets and constellations. The name zodiac comes from the Greek zodiakos, zodion being a diminutive or a smaller form of zoon, which means animal. So zodiac literally relates to a circle of little animals. Appropriately so, as the belt in the sky is divided into 12 30-degree parts called signs that have animal associations. From antiquity to the Renaissance, those who knew how to read the stars were consulted for mystical insights regarding both temporal events and the ascension of one's personal soul. Remember, as above, so below. Just as stars could act on earthly forces, so could they work on human emotions, a principle pervasive in medieval magic. The aforementioned Thomas Aquinas, who swapped the classical virtue of justice for his principal virtue, prudence, struggled with this concept, arguing that stars ruled the body while God ruled the soul, an attempt to reconcile Christianity with astrology. In the 15th century, Pico de la Mirandola insisted the stars neither caused nor heralded earthly events, but his fellow philosopher Pietro Pomponazzi disagreed. Despite the debate, the stars as emblems of ascension pervaded Renaissance art. Alchemy and astrology were 2 categories of Hermeticism explored by Renaissance artists, including those who made the tarot. The idea of the Book of Thoth, however, predates Hermeticism and was not explored by Renaissance artists, but it is an idea tied to Egypt that occultists would later impose upon the tarot, and there are intersecting ideas here worth exploring. So while we're on the topic, let's overview the Book of Thoth. Thoth, the god I mentioned, was tied to Hermes in the Hellenistic period, was in Egyptian mythology the vizier to the gods Osiris and his son Horus. When Horus retired to the heavens, Thoth was said to rule as pharaoh for more than 3,000 years, during which time he passed on his wealth of knowledge about art, science, religious truths, and the hieroglyphs, literally meaning sacred carvings. The priests of Thoth supposedly kept secret texts with his magical instructions, which would grant one extreme power, a power to command gods. These texts were called the Book of Thoth, and its wisdom contained a special kind of gnosis, a Greek word meaning knowledge, but a particular kind of knowledge gained through experience, and in this case, spiritual experience, which would lead to transformation or enlightenment. 18th and 19th century occultists would put this idea of the Book of Thoth into conversation with Hermetic texts to argue that the tarot is a continuation of these ancient ideas in which a mystic can guide a willing, attentive student toward a philosopher's stone-like cure for mortality. Kabbalah is a form of Jewish mysticism that arose in the 12th and 13th centuries, pulling from earlier traditions and spreading outside of Judaism in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, giving us the Christian Kabbalah, and from the Christian Kabbalah we get the Hermetic Kabbalah. Relevant to the topic of tarot are 2 particular Kabbalistic teachings: Hermetic ideas about Enoch and the Tree of Life. The figure of Enoch is only briefly mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Genesis says that he walked with God and then he was no more because he took him. This idea that a man who walked with God was taken up into heaven, perhaps meaning he became immortal, having never tasted death, captured the imagination of Jewish mystics and Gnostics. 3 apocryphal texts build upon this biblical tradition. The 1st and 2nd books of Enoch tell about how he was taken to heaven and there received divine revelation at the throne of God. The 3rd book of Enoch tells how a rabbi named Ishmael ascended to the 7th heaven, where he was taught eternal secrets and mysteries at the throne of God by an angel named Metatron, who was once named Enoch. You can see why Hermetic philosophers would find this so fascinating. 7 levels of ascension which grant hidden knowledge and immortality, something akin to the Philosopher's Stone or the Ladder of Planets. Some even equated Enoch with Hermes Trismegistus, so the names Thoth, Hermes, Enoch, and Metatron all became synonymous with the idea of some ascendant master, or as Plato would label such a being, the philosopher king. Comparable paths and promises await a student of the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. Like the Tetractys of Pythagoras, the Tree of Life is a symbol of both creation and spiritual ascent, with simultaneous physical and cosmological parallels. What we have in this symbol of Jewish mysticism are 3 pillars, with the passive Pillar of Severity, as it's called, on the left, and the active Pillar of Mercy on the right, and divine grace in the middle called Equilibrium. Note the Platonic parallels: 3 forces, with black and white being brought into balance. In the tree there are 10 nodes, same as in the Tetractys, called Sephiroth, Hebrew for numbers. These are connected by 22 pathways, each pathway associated with one of the 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. You can think of the tree existing in 4 copies, referred to as the 4 worlds, denoting creation across 4 stages from emanation down to the physical universe. While each of these concepts could form a video on their own, the sum of their parts is called the Tree of Life, which served as a tool for meditation. A mystic, studying and contemplating the elements of the Tree of Life, could progress up a path toward enlightenment. Perhaps you can see the tarot parallels with this. 3 sets of 7, 10 pips, 22 major arcana, 4 suits like the worlds encompassing the pips/Sephiroth, and an overarching idea of the sum acting as a tool for meditation which can lead to spiritual enlightenment. Perhaps the Tree of Life, and for later occultists the tarot, could serve as your tool to ascend the 7 heavens. Finally, there are a number of other contexts which could be added to the list of considerations that capture the interests of Renaissance artists, giving us much to contemplate when studying the tarot as an artifact of that time. We already talked about how Sufi poetry inspired works like Blanquerna, fusing mysticism in Islam with that in Christianity. One of the occultists we'll talk about soon even brought in tantric symbolism, though that and various other movements like symbolist art or Freemasonry would have more influence in the 19th century than existed during the Renaissance. As one last consideration, we could return to Blanquerna and see it as the first of many romance novels, even if that romance was more confined for divinity. But romantic legends would blossom, and some of these made their way into the tarot. The Rosenthal Visconti Sforza tarot has 23 surviving cards with some unique inclusions, a male figure holding a falcon, for example, and the Holy Grail from Arthurian legend. The 15th century Gildenhall and Goldschmidt decks also have the Holy Grail with an Ouroboros. Perhaps some artists saw the Holy Grail as a kind of philosopher's stone, and one such as Arthur as an overlooked prime substance. It seems like just as today we have innumerable tarot decks modeled after pop culture, the legends and tales of their time inspired the original Renaissance tarot artists as well. Alright, putting all these contexts together, here's another chart, this one lining up the classical, medieval, and Renaissance influences that were being considered by artists at the time of the tarot's creation. We see from this how the tarot acts as an artifact of the Renaissance, one of many manifestations of artists, poets, and philosophers exploring ideas related to the world, the heavens, and one's existence in temporality and eternity. Contexts from classical antiquity, medieval reinterpretations of their past, and mystical philosophies from Christianity and Islam were all brought to the same table to converse and exchange ideas. The images on the tarot are products of these conversations. So now, with that rich context of ideas being explored in the Renaissance established, let's look at the 15th century Tarot of Marseille as if it were a triumphal procession. Say the Fool is our Blanquerna, facing the journey ahead. We can think of the Fool not as part of the procession, but as the everyman, one who starts off lacking wisdom, but who appears ready for a journey to greater heights. Some cards even have a hawk and a dog, 2 animals that Ramon the Fool travels with in Blanquerna. What lies ahead in the triumph are not just 21 trump cards, but 3 sets of 7 cards guiding an inquisitive mind on a journey to a higher plane in 3 sections. Section 1 contains a number of characters like those from our Blanquerna triumphal procession, and even a Platonic charioteer. The Marseille sequence proceeds as follows. First, the Magician. Second, the Papess. Third, the Empress. Fourth, the Emperor. Fifth, the Pope. Sixth, the Lovers. And seventh, the Chariot. From the gambling, dining magician, more the juggling jester than a regal wizard, to the temporal lovers, this is a section governed by the Platonic soul of appetite. The queen and king are, of course, above your common folk. Yes, there is a female pope, the Papess or the Popess as she's often called, though the notion of a woman with priesthood authority offended some who replaced her with the likes of a Spanish captain or a god. But in many decks, the priestess persists. Legal authority rules over our Natana, who in the Blanquerna story could only reach the level of abbess, but the pope trumps the temporal rulers. And yet, just as Blanquerna found after becoming abbot, bishop, and pope, even religious leaders are bound by earthly matters, and all mortals are bound by love. Look at the lovers. There are two women, two Aphrodites, as it were, a choice for the charioteer between sensual and celestial love. Cupid, son of Venus/Aphrodite, waits with the arrow ready, as if asking the venturer whom he will choose, which will steer the chariot. Even as our fool or our Blanquerna commits to the journey, the chariot bearing the seeker of wisdom is pulled by a light and a dark horse, as in Plato's Phaedrus, or the two pillars on either side of the tree of life. By the way, I love these horses. I'll never get over how silly medieval and Renaissance art can be sometimes. But thus concludes the first section of our trumps. Section 2 contains our three cardinal virtues: justice, strength, and temperance. Remember, Aquinas reserved prudence as the composite of all, carving up two pairs of cards that show the struggles that await those who strive for something greater as they conquer the Platonic soul of will. Here we have the 8th card, Justice, the 9th, the Hermit, the 10th, the Wheel of Fortune, 11th, Strength, 12th, the Hanged Man, 13th, Death, and 14th, Temperance. It's worth noting that we encounter the three cardinal virtues in a reverse order from what we'd expect given Plato's arrangement of temperance, strength, and then prudence to aid the civilian in his rise through the ranks. And many Italian decks did maintain the Platonic sequence of virtues. Tarots in Sicily and Bologna further scrambled the order, going temperance, then justice, then strength, and Marseille established this reverse sequence. Some explanations have been ventured. Maybe the virtues were a divine gift proceeding in the opposite direction as time and fate. Or maybe this was an impression of justice reaching to those lower in society to help them develop more exalted virtues. Robert Place summarized his assessment well, quote, "Renaissance artists apparently allowed themselves to be creative in their use of these symbols, but they consistently made use of three cardinal virtues that form the three parts of prudence in the Platonic/Stoic system. Without written confirmation of the reasoning in the artist's mind, the viewer is left to contemplate the possibilities, but the virtues are present nonetheless to aid our fool venturing through the wilderness of mortal struggles." Before moving on to the final section, let's look at the two pairs interspersed between the virtues. The Hermit, as in Blanquerna, trumps all regal and religious offices. In older decks, this card was also called the Old Man, or Time, depicting a Renaissance-style personification of the classical god Saturn as a hunched figure with an hourglass. Opinions on Saturn conflicted in the Renaissance, some seeing time as a destructive force, and others, particularly Neoplatonists, associating Saturn with artistic genius and contemplation. The Hermit seems to embody this reading, a Christian ascetic, giving up the luxuries and temptations of the world to find light in devout contemplation. The Wheel of Fortune fascinates me. As we move away from the physical world, we glimpse the mechanism of mortality, the Wheel of Fate, an icon associated since antiquity with Fortuna, the Roman equivalent of the Greek Tyche. Here there are three beings rising, ruling, and falling. These call to mind another classical goddess associated with fate and fortune, Ananke, or necessity, the sister/mate of Kronos, personification of time. In the tarot, temporality is trumped by fortune. Ananke is the mother of the three fates: Lachesis, the thread-spinning embodiment of the past; Clotho, the present, who draws and measures the thread of life; and Atropos, who as the future cuts the thread ending life. As is evident in this section of the Triumph, death will conquer all. Not even the Fates have power over death. And yet in some decks, a fourth man is present, as in the Visconti's Forza. Perhaps here we glimpse a debate on reincarnation, life as a cycle, a wheel, more than one thread measured and cut. Plato, and thus many, especially early Neoplatonists, believed in reincarnation, as did some early Christian Gnostics. While the Byzantine Emperor Justinian declared the belief in reincarnation heretical in the 6th century, the idea was reintroduced to Western Europe by Sufis and Kabbalists in Spain during the 12th and 13th centuries. As translators like Ficino turned their attention to Plato in the 15th century, Christians had to grapple with the fact that the great ancient philosopher believed in what they viewed as a heresy. How would they reconcile this? Would reincarnation act like the 3 Christian virtues, melding seamlessly with the classical cardinal virtues? Or would orthodoxy dominate once again? The discrepancies between decks seem to be a small artifact of that debate. One final note in this section: the Hanged Man, originally called the Traitor, represents the fall from the Wheel of Fortune, the inevitable end to mortality we all must face eventually. If we return to classical mythology, Tyche would be the Greek goddess of good fortune, while this is Nemesis, the awful fate from the goddess of divine punishment. And what awaits is Thanatos, death. These 2 cards combined reflect the 2 that preceded the middle virtue. On either side of strength or fortitude lies fate. One may choose the exalted path of the hermit, or else Nemesis awaits. But no matter the path, death trumps all. It's a chilling reminder about the end of all roads. But I have to point out that one of our to-be-explored occultists, Coeur de Gébelin, believes that the hangman was upside down. He thought that this was the 4th missing virtue, prudence, and that it was a man, right side up, lifting a foot to avoid a snake. The snake, he said, had been misunderstood and distorted to become a rope, and the wise man had become a traitor. A later occultist, Atea, would maintain this in what Robert Place described as his most charming modification to the tarot in the 18th century, a woman personifying prudence lifting her skirt. I just love that they thought people had in their ignorance believed that the card was upside down and thus distorted, when, in their ignorance, that is the very thing they became guilty of. Anyway, we've died and passed through the 3rd virtue in the Triumph. Let's go to the last section. Section 3 contains the final foe, his fall, and the philosopher's ascension through the heavens. The cards in this section are the 15th, the Devil, the 16th, the Tower, 17th, the Star, 18th, the Moon, 19th, the Sun, 20th, Judgment, and 21st, the World. Some might be surprised to find the Devil leading the Platonic soul of reason, but recall that the Devil card is only the first in Act 3 of a story. Yes, the Devil has power, trumping all that came before it, including the Pope, but he and his tower will fall. This half-human, half-creature with 2 enchained servants seems to be an inversion of the Kabbalistic Tree of Life or the Neoplatonic Chariot, or even the Lover's card from earlier, a distortion of the divine quest, the bad ending, we might say. But this is not the end of the Triumph. The Tower, another intriguing card, is being struck by lightning and consumed by flame. Early Italian decks called this card Fire, Lightning, or the House of the Devil. The crenellation atop the tower suggests the toppling of a crown, an end to the kingdom reminiscent of the biblical revelation of John. With the collapse of the Devil and his tower, the seeker of divine wisdom now ascends through the heavens. In an image rife with Neoplatonic imagery, a woman straddles land and sea, pouring water from 2 pitchers. We see symbols of a soul's ascent, from the 7 stars under one great star to the tree wherein rests a bird, yet another soul symbol. There's even alchemical symbolism here in the opposites: dry and wet, hot and cold, red and white, all descriptors used as parts of the magnum opus. We see comparable juxtapositions in the Moon and Sun cards, which are themselves complementary opposites, a feminine and a masculine couple like the Empress and Emperor, or the Popess and the Pope. And in the images, we get similar pairings of 2 hounds, or 2 people of land and sea, or land and sky. Having traversed the stars, moon, and sun, we arrive at the final judgment. With more Revelation-style imagery, an angel sounds the trumpet, and a figure facing away from the viewer stands between a woman and a man, as if the viewer of the card is in the Triumph and has reached the final step. Which path did you choose along the way? None can escape judgment, and what awaits is the world, the divine inheritance. Think less of the world and more inherit the world, to use some biblical phrasing there. In the center of a crown wreath stands the anima mundi, the world's soul, the fifth quintessential element, which in alchemy and mysticism could be symbolized as a woman, or as Christ, or as Hermes. Here a woman stands surrounded by 4 emblems of the evangelists, the lion, the bull, the eagle, and the man, based on descriptions of God's throne found in Ezekiel and Revelation. It's an image that artists explored for centuries, imbued with Christian, alchemical, and Neoplatonic imagery. For a Renaissance philosopher contemplating the ancient alongside Christianity, the significance of 3 divisions of 7, 4 suits, 10 pips, and 3 virtues with a 4th composite virtue awaiting the fool turned saint at the end of a long, harrowing journey would have been a captivating notion. The images corroborate the composition of the deck itself as an artifact of academic fascination. It is worth recalling that not all decks Major Arcana followed this exact pattern from the Tarot of Marseille, but variations surprisingly don't do much to disrupt these ideas of triumphal processions, 3 souls, and a quest to develop virtues and acquire enlightenment. Characters usually keep confined to these sections. Lovers and chariots sometimes swap places, as do judgment and the world, and it can be interesting to contemplate the story the artist had in mind with little shufflings around, but the cards still keep confined to their respective sections. The most movement can be seen with the 3 virtues, and sometimes allocating 1 virtue for each of the 3 sections. It seems the Renaissance artists employed the tarot to explore a relatively consistent theme, a narrative of a quest for divine light, employing the structure of a triumphal procession, imbued with ideas from Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, and other mystical philosophies, contemplated and debated during the 15th and 16th centuries. This is the tarot which later generations inherited, and like the Renaissance thinkers took, argued about, and reinvented their classical and medieval inheritance, new minds from the 18th century to today have likewise inherited, contemplated, and integrated their inheritance with new, more modern ideas. Let's talk about the occult tarot. It's becoming increasingly common knowledge that a lot that's been claimed about the tarot isn't historical, as is evident from this video so far. So no, the tarot did not originate in ancient Egypt, and yes, it was predominantly a game. And yet when asked what people think about regarding the tarot, they often describe cartomancy, the use of cards to see the future. Is this how they were reimagined by occultists, and is this how they were used in the Renaissance? Which means, okay, before we get to the occult tarot, we do real quick need to talk about how Renaissance owners of tarot cards used them. When they used them, that is. Many surviving cards were more likely art displays rather than playing cards, else they would have been more subject to the wear and tear that claimed cards that have not survived all the way till today. But regarding the cards that actually were used, how were they used? And the answer is a little bit of a debate. In his History of the Tarot, Robert Place quickly and clearly conceded that the cards were predominantly a game, and yet he drops hints throughout his book that they may have been a little bit more than that, even back toward their creation. 4-suit decks, that is, non-tarot decks without any kind of dedicated trump suit, seem to have been employed for more than just card games. 2 Renaissance-era books describe the use of such decks for divination, fortune-telling. Fanti's 16th century Trionfo di Fortuna describes the use of either time or the roll of 2 dice to read one's fortune on any of a number of wheels, each wheel with 21 spokes. The frontispiece of the book has a number of tarot parallels. Here we see a quite worldly pope with 2 women, virtue and sensuality, our 2 Aphrodites here. They sit over a world with conflicting influences turning wheels of fate. Time and a tower even feature as an athlete and astrologer guide the mystic with divinatory tools. This makes it seem like divination was about more than just fortune telling, but also a method of guiding the seeker of wisdom to their best possible destiny. Place also points to the 16th century fortune telling book Le Sorti, published in Venice in 1540. The text recommends using 9 cards from the suit of coins for divination. Because nothing more than that is specified, it is possible these cards could have come from any deck, so a tarot might have been used for divination, just not the Major Arcana. And here's a fun one that you can try with friends. 16th century literary references describe a Renaissance parlor game. A poet, ladies at court, or even lay people in the street would deal out trump cards to each other, and then they had to describe why each person matches whatever they were dealt. A performing poet might find they had to describe why a pretty lady matched death or the devil, and he'd do so in verse. The Merlini Kokai sonnets describe a scene where trumps were dealt and used to determine the fates of the main characters. Historian Franco Pratesi discovered a similar account in a document written 200 years later kept at the University of Bologna library, and this document employed the entire tarot to read characters' fates. Robert Place points to this as an argument that there's evidence for an ongoing tradition of using tarot for divination, at least from the 16th century on, though I would note that there's a lot of silence in the interim. But he points to dice card parallels to try to fill that silence. We do know dice were a common tool, both for gambling and divination, not just during the Renaissance, but all the way back to antiquity. Place points out that if one rolled 3 dice, they would have 56 possible combinations, the same as the number of cards in the Minor Arcana, with 10 pips and 4 courts. If 2 dice are thrown, 21 possible combinations, and thus divinatory answers result, the same as the number of trumps in the tarot. The 1 and 2 in cards were originally called the ace and deuce, and we still retain the name ace, but these were also the original names of the 1 and 2 on dice. He theorizes that cards gradually came to replace dice for divination because the images were more appealing and they gave people a wealth of new ideas to interpret. While I love the idea of artist and viewer as co-creators of meaning, even meaning that can grant the same kind of inspiration and guidance one might derive from, say, reading an inspiring book, I'm skeptical of a long heritage of divination behind the tarot itself. Numerical parallels, of which this video has already abounded, are cool, but they can be coincidental. There seems to be a lot of stock in numbers that can shift. Do we emphasize that there are 21 trumps or 22 to count the fool? Additionally, early tarot cards varied in the number of courts and trumps, making connections tenuous at best. Add to that the lack of explicit literary evidence in a culture abounding with literary innovation, and I hesitate to put too much stock in any arguments from silence. The historians Deckard, De Palis, and Dummett are much more skeptical than Place. They argue that the images on the trumps were exoteric, that is, external, belonging outside, rather than esoteric, meaning secret or hidden within. Think of it like this. I show you an image of a woman with a blindfold on, holding scales in one hand and a sword in the other. What is this a symbol of? Justice is blind is a common saying today, and the scales in particular have an overt connection to the abstract concept. Thus, the use of such a symbol would not be esoteric or cryptic if I was using it to communicate the idea of justice. Today, anyone seeing this image would be expected to understand the meaning. Well, these historians argue the images in the tarot would have been just as exoteric to Italians in the Renaissance, and a couple ideas persist to today, like the Grim Reaper being associated with death. But could there also be esoteric symbolism concealed within the cards in addition to the exoteric symbolism, intelligible only to those who would have studied Plato or Hermes Trismegistus or astrology or other arcane subjects? Well, here's how the historians summarize their stance in the book A Wicked Pack of Cards. It is intrinsically plausible that there should have been such symbolism in a special pack of cards invented at the time and in that milieu. People of the Renaissance reveled in hidden symbolism, and the occult sciences enjoyed greater prestige in the Christian world than at any other time before or since. Any theory to this effect must pass a severe test, however. It must depend not on any direct evidence that can be cited, but on the intrinsic plausibility of the particular interpretation proposed. That is to say, if this symbol in this card means whatever someone's saying it means, you need some good evidence to prove that particular interpretation. And regarding this evidence, they go on saying, which must draw on nothing that was not available at the time and place. But it ought not be too plausible. It cannot be anything which, if present, would leap to the eye of a man of the Renaissance looking at the cards. The reason is that if the trump sequence was designed in accordance with any esoteric symbolism, this fact was very quickly and generally overlooked. None of the 15th and 16th century sources so much as hints at such a thing, and the absence of such a hint from some of these sources would be very surprising if their authors had had any inkling that any such symbolism was there to be found. Oh man, these authors have a way with words, and they will kill the magic. But they are correct. Any claims that we would make about esoteric significance in the tarot would have to be backed by a really tricky balance of evidence, with ideas that probably existed at the time but were not so well known that anyone would have seen it. We have to account for the silence. And the abounding evidence we do have of how people in the Renaissance saw the tarot leaves no indication of divinatory practice or esoteric instruction. Sermons and legal prohibition speak scathingly of the cards, and yet with all all this ridicule, hidden messages are not mentioned. Lolio's 16th century Inventiva dismisses the card's inventor not as a heretic or a necromancer or anything, but as a drunk. A serious investigation of the cards did not seem worth the author's time. These historians suggest an 18th century Bolognese deck was likely to be used for fortune telling before any French deck was. They point to a single loose manuscript sheet giving clear cartomantic interpretations of 35 cards, showing the use of the trumps as well as pips in divination. The meanings of the cards seem to predate what later occultists hypothesized, with different and simpler interpretations, and no separate meaning if the card was found upside down rather than right side up. Some of the interpretations are intuitive. The sun stands for day, the moon for night, death stands for death, love for love, but some of the others can be strange and a little amusing. The King of Batons indicates an unmarried gentleman waits in your future. The Queen of Batons, a harlot. The Knight of Batons, a door knocker. I'm assuming this isn't a door-to-door salesman, but I think I'd rather draw death if it did. The Ten of Cups just reads roof tiles, which I think might be kind of useless without the house that is associated with the Ace of Cups. It's a fun little source, this manuscript page. But in sum, it seems that during the Renaissance, the tarot was an object of artistic fascination for the artists, but when used, the cards were more often than not just a game. So where did the notion of esoteric meaning buried in the cards come from? We can hardly blame occultists of the 18th and 19th centuries for their fascination with the tarot in light of the abundance of symbolism and ideas being explored by the Renaissance artists, along with the numerical connections to ancient ideas. It's easy to let your imagination run wild with possibilities, and boy did the occultists do just that. 1781 is the year that marks the dividing line between early tarot history and the modern era. This is where we bring back the formerly mentioned Cour de Gébelin. As the story goes, he stumbled upon an unnamed countess's Tarot of Marseille. When he saw the World card, he was hooked, recognizing it a mystical allegory. He went on to explain the significance of every trump card to the Countess and her guests, obsessed with ideas like symbolism, a primeval golden age, an ancient universal language. He fit the tarot neatly into his fascination with all things ancient. In 1781, he published The Primitive World, where he not so much argues as flat out asserts that the tarot originated in Egypt, and thereby was transmitted with secret teachings that date all the way back to Hermes Trismegistus. To be clear, he's not talking about the Mamluk deck, he's talking ancient Egypt. He declared that the tarot is, quote, an Egyptian book escaped from barbarism, from the ravages of time, from accidental and deliberate conflagrations, and from what is even more disastrous, ignorance. This is where he declared his fabricated etymology I mentioned earlier, as well as the significance of numbers. 7 was sacred to the Egyptians, and he was right about that. 7 was sacred to many world religions. Hence, 3 groups of 7 trumps, and 4 minor suits with 14 cards each, 14 being 7 times 2. The number 22 trumps, I guess we're back to counting the fool, connected to, quote, the 22 letters of the Egyptian alphabet common to the Hebrews and Orientals, which also served as numerals, end quote. He's talking about the Hebrew alphabet here. The 4 suits, he said, represented the 4 estates of Egyptian society: swords representing sovereigns and military, sticks agriculture, cups clergy, and coins commerce. But his biggest declaration was that the trump cards, in a sequence starting with the end, the 21st, and working backwards, told us about the creation of the world as taught by Hermes Trismegistus. The cards, then, were actually a discrete method of preserving ancient forbidden wisdom, like alchemical principles. Disguised as a trivial game, they'd evade the detection of any of the ignorant, that's the esoteric knowledge right there, but they'd also escape notice of anyone who'd want to see ancient knowledge destroyed. Amusement would lead to the cards' preservation, and with the cards, the arcana they surreptitiously preserve. De Gébelin saw the tarot as the prime material used in alchemy to create the Philosopher's Stone, something overlooked, but once discovered, studied, and understood, would preserve a hermetic path to spiritual gold. But there is a problem, you see. The knowledge, though preserved, had been corrupted. He thus commissioned one Mademoiselle Linot to make engravings of the trumps as he believed they ought to be represented. You'll see this cycle a lot. Someone discovers the tarot, analyzes it, and then reinvents it, trying to restore it to something old, but in the process creating something new. And this is also where we get the Hanged Man I mentioned earlier. He says, says it was never meant to be a traitor, but rather the virtue prudence, as it must have been in ancient times, so he had it changed. Other cards were modified to be more Egyptian, or rather the Egyptian flavor according to the tastes of 18th century Europe. The Chariot then became Osiris, the Devil became Typhon, the Greek name for Set. To account for very Christian, very not Egyptian cards, he changed the female pope to a high priestess and the pope to the Hierophant, or the high priest. Comte de Millet followed Gébelon's work and built upon it. He assigned a Hebrew letter to each of the major arcana, starting with the world as Aleph and then working backward to the Fool. I find it funny that the reverse sequence existed all the way back in the cards from China and the Middle East, was then lost, and then came back, but in the wrong suit. Anyway, de Millet treated the cards as hieroglyphs by 18th century European understanding, puzzles to contemplate for communication with the divine. If the trumps were to be read last to first, they would show the descent of humans into ignorance, matching de Gébelon's view of human history. Thus, read first to last, they, like the Corpus Hermeticum, would describe a path back toward a better, more enlightened state. Our final 18th century occultist is Atteya, born Jean-Baptiste Aliette. Not much is known about the guy's personal life, but I have to mention that after getting divorced at 29 years old, he changed his name to the reverse of his surname, from Aliette to Atteya, and quit being a seed merchant in order to dedicate himself to cartomancy, a term he coined, referring to card divination. There's got to be more of the story there, but we're left wondering. So, lest you ever think that a haircut after a breakup is extreme, just remember Atteya changing his name and dedicating himself to divination. Anyway, his writings are the first mention of fortune-telling in France, explicitly by means of tarot cards. This Hermetic enthusiast largely followed de Gébelon's claims. He called the tarot the Book of Thoth itself, describing the cards as a series of Egyptian hieroglyphs with trumps that illustrate the Corpus Hermeticum. Their designs were originally engraved on leaves of gold, he said, under the supervision of 17 magi presided over by Hermes Trismegistus himself. They contained the creation of the world and instructions on how to make the universal medicine, but that was, by his calculation, 3,953 years before his own publication. Very specific. The card's meaning had been distorted with time. Like de Gébelon, he commissioned a corrective deck, which he, quite ostentatiously if you ask me, called the Book of Thoth, though it's now referred to as the Grand Atteya. And like de Gébelon's deck, its changes create a romanticized 18th century view of ancient Egypt. The temples and obelisks are more neoclassical, and its figures are more European than Egyptian. And this is where we get the charming hanged man converted into a woman lifting her skirt to prudently avoid stepping on a snake. She's even holding a caduceus, that T-shape with two snakes, a symbol of Hermes combined with the female anima mundi, making this not Egyptian, but a really cool weaving together of Hermetic ideas. He even intertwined the four suits with the four terrestrial elements, coins to fire, swords to air, cups to water, and staffs to earth, and imbued the deck with extra astrological symbols, like this glyph for the planet Mercury in the Two of Coins. So, were these occultists founded in history? No. Were they creative and enthusiastic, and is it fun for modern readers? Yeah, at least in my opinion. As we enter the 19th century, increased interest in the occult leads to increased popularity of the tarot, particularly as a divinatory device. Eliphas Levi also sounds like he had an interesting life, ditching the priesthood to practice ceremonial magic. Can't tell if he sounds like the protagonist or antagonist of a story, but a deacon turned occult cleric? Has to be one of them. He wrote about the tarot as a powerful esoteric tool for serious occultists. No messing around with parlor games here. The goal was self-mastery and a mystical path to enlightenment. The tarot a tool to the culmination of all these Hermetic and Neoplatonic ambitions. He agreed with Atteya that the tarot was the Book of Thoth, but he also believed that the cards were of Jewish origin and based on Kabbalah. To Levi, this wasn't a contradiction. He thought Kabbalah stemmed from Egyptian origins, and thus both symbols and philosophy from ancient Egypt and Jewish mysticism pervaded the deck. He correlated the four minor suits with the four letters of the Tetragrammaton, which, combined with other occultists' theories, imbued the minor arcana with a number of correlations, including the four aforementioned signs of the evangelists, the four elements, and fixed signs of the zodiac. Here's a chart showing the many connections that had been imposed upon the tarot's suits. Note the bottom line, we've got the four worlds from the Kabbalistic tree of life here too. Levi claimed the 10 pips of each suit represented represented the 10 Sephiroth, and the 4 worlds were represented by the 4 suits. Meditating on the tarot, then, was one way to ascend the Kabbalistic tree of life, moving toward mystical insights. Some of Levi's interpretations here were strained, to say the least. He saw the juggler's pose as an esoteric parallel to the Hebrew letter Aleph, with one arm raised and the other lowered. In Kabbalistic tradition, the second letter Beth means house or home, which doesn't really relate to a female pope or a high priestess, so he called the house a sanctuary of law or a secret teaching, which mystery the woman embodies. If nothing else, one's ability to find meaning in the tarot is a testament to human creativity. Unlike de Gébelin and de Théa, Levi did not have a deck commissioned to restore lost truths. Well, not totally. I mean, his Kabbalistic interpretations effectively created a new deck with associations commonly accepted ever since, but he also might have been working on a deck. Some of his writings include illustrations of, for example, a new chariot card, which would inspire the later Waite-Smith devil card. This chariot had the Arabic numeral 7 along with the Hebrew letter Zayin on either side of the charioteer, and horses swapped out for Egyptian sphinxes. Between them was a tantric symbol for the union of male and female placed under the disc of the Egyptian god Horus. The chariot itself was even transformed into the cubic stone of the alchemist, a symbol of the prime material. You'd think with all these occultists adding new symbols and insights to the point of needing to recreate entire decks to fit the associations they're striving to extract from or embed into the tarot, there'd be some, I don't know, self-awareness or humility regarding their work, at least some acknowledgement of what they are adding to a tradition, or that there's some guesswork going on, more intuition than evidence. Well, Levi does not give us that. Quite the opposite, actually. He believed that his assertions were eternal truths, that all cultures knew the tarot and its secret universal doctrines, and there were clues to this all around if you just knew how to look for them. Silence in the sources was actually more evidence. Mystics were guarding the secret. References were cryptic, so for example, if a book has 22 chapters, like the Revelation of John in the Bible, that's a tarot reference. The Christian Chi Rho monogram was not only a symbol of Jesus, but turned to make a Latin cross and placed between an alpha and omega, you could transliterate the letters as a monogram reading Taro, T-A-R-O. Add that rota could be interpreted as Latin for wheel, like the Wheel of Fortune, and suddenly any reference to wheels were potential tarot references. If you've ever been looking for examples of the Kafka trap or ad hoc fallacy, Levi's given you tons to work with here. Yet Levi looks positively responsible compared to the charlatan Paul Christian, who went so far as to forge evidence connecting the tarot to Egypt. In 1980, Dummett singles out Christian's writing as one of the worst examples of false ascription in occult literature. And again, I just have to read you the summary from Decker, de Paulus, and Dummett comparing Christian with Levi. They write, quote, "For all the flimsiness of Levi's argumentation, the unreliability of his historical claims, the rank absurdity of many of his assertions, his sincerity is beyond question. It conferred upon his work a certain magisterial authority. Christian's sincerity, by contrast, is utterly dubious. To suppose that he believed what he wrote is to view him as having deluded himself by sustained and detailed fantasies to an unparalleled degree. And there are no grounds for supposing that. The massive scale of his fabrications and the lack of conviction in his writings render his contributions to occult theory wholly insubstantial. That is why Levi became the founder of the whole modern rendering of the Western tradition of magic, while Christian's work is no more than a curious cul-de-sac." Jeez, guys, tell us what you really think about him. But hey, it is Paul Christian that we have to credit for the terms Major and Minor Arcana, which today we use to refer to the trumps versus the pips. So at least he's got some legacy. Levi did set the tone, though, for much of the occult character of the tarot afterward. The French physician and hypnotist Papus further applied the 4 letters of the Tetragrammaton to every other aspect of the tarot. He later founded the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Cross with Oswald Wirth, a Swiss occultist and Freemason. Wirth published the first redesigned occult tarot since the Grand Ateya in 1889, basing his deck off Levi's teachings. Each card was given the Arabic numeral and the Hebrew letter, the Fool was moved to the penultimate position and assigned the letter Shin, the Magician got a makeover, the Chariot got its sphinxes, as did the Wheel of Fortune. Toward the end of the 19th century, another society based on Freemasonry and Hermeticism was established. You might have heard of it before, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Their teachings influenced by these occultists occultists, and more. In a document called Book T, the Golden Dawn describes the 78 cards and their meanings with names now commonly used in English decks. They also ascribed Hebrew letters to the cards, but they left the Fool in the first position with the letter Aleph, leading to a re-lettering of the Major Arcana. The names of the 4 suits were also changed into tools used by magicians associated with Levi's elements. So here, let me update the chart for you. There. Now, perhaps most important for the modern tarot is not what the Golden Dawn wrote in Book T, but the result of 2 people who met there. In 1901, 2 individuals both joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Arthur Edward Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith. A clerk who wrote poetry in his spare time, A.E. Waite stumbled upon the writings of Eliphas Levi amidst his enthusiastic study of esotericism at the Library of the British Museum during his early 20s. A decade later, he was introduced to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and he became a Freemason a decade after that. Though undulating in and out of such organizations, his fascination for the occult and arcane never faded. Meanwhile, Pixie, a nickname of Pamela Smith's, bounced around the world on her artistic, esoteric journey. She was born in London, the only child of merchants, moved to Jamaica when she was 10, and after a few years of travels between the 2 locations and New York, she enrolled in a Brooklyn Art Institute at 15. 3 years later, her mother died, followed by her father 3 years after that, leaving her orphaned at 21. She returned to England, working in theatrical design and illustration, including 2 books about Jamaican folklore. She was known for her mythical, otherworldly depictions in what's called the symbolist style, works that captured sensual beauty and portrayed subjects based on dreams, mythology, and imagination. While creating, she would put herself into a kind of trance, listening to classical music and letting her hand carry her where it would. Amidst her work, she was introduced to the Golden Dawn. 8 years after they met, Waite approached Smith with an idea. A new tarot deck, one that would appeal to both the art world and occultists. Waite had little interest in divination, writing at one point that he hated such profanum vulgus, a profane crowd or unholy rabble. He was not afraid to label false other occultists' correlations, such as those between the trumps and the Hebrew alphabet, saying such associations did harm to the original mystical story and led away from an understanding of the true tarot. This may sound more historically responsible, but like Levi and others before him, Waite's solution was to engage in the same process of meaning making on top of his meaning interpreting by creating a brand new deck to rectify lost symbols. Waite's main interest was the Major Arcana, which he saw as containing the mystical quest, while the Minor Arcana was more the fascination of the rabble who liked divinatory devices. So he commissioned Pixie Smith to design a deck with symbols and meanings that he had in mind, trusting Smith's spontaneous and intuitive manner to fill in the gaps. He describes Smith as a, quote, most imaginative and abnormally psychic artist who drifted into the Golden Dawn and marinated in the ceremonies, even if oblivious to its deeper meanings. He sounds both charmed by her, but also condescending, recognizing her artistic skill while treating her as an infant, needing proper guidance to do anything with her craft. And yet, just as he accused her of frolicking through the ceremonies without a lick of understanding, so did he approach any of her arts that he did not directly dictate. While we don't know their methodology exactly, it seems like Waite gave Smith 1 round of instructions for the Major Arcana, let her complete her work, and then gave her freedom to express herself in the Minor Arcana, which she did by blending her intuitive talent with sources like Atea or the Solabusca tarot deck, the only other known deck to have fully animated pips. The decks even have the same proportions, and individual cards show clear parallels, like the 3 of Swords, or Smith's Fool, and the Solabusca 5 of Cups. But Waite's written commentary on the symbols and meaning of the deck seemed to have been made after her work was complete, sometimes with only a cursory glance from what feels like a first-time observer. When he describes her Knight of Wands, for example, Waite simply states that the knight is passing mounds or pyramids. Like Waite isn't quite sure what Smith depicted, and he doesn't really care to find out. The result of their collaboration is the Waite-Smith deck, which has also been called the Rider-Waite or the Rider-Waite-Smith deck from the name of its 1909 publisher, and it has become the most popular modern tarot deck. If you have a modern deck, it's probably either the Waite-Smith itself, or it's based off the Waite-Smith. So what is the tarot today? For many, it could simply be an artifact of occult fascination. Some people collect decks without even using them, perhaps not too dissimilar to those that survived the 15th century. They're curious works of art, and it can be thrilling just to sit with a deck and flip through the cards, marveling at them individually or trying to detect patterns or connections across multiple cards. Personally, I like to look for the lovers cards to see if there are one or two women, and then to see if I can find other instances of pairs or trios elsewhere in the Major Arcana. In the Minor Arcana, I like to flip through to see the creative ways that artists have worked with the different numbers of symbols. Others treat the cards as a game like it was in the Renaissance. I thoroughly enjoyed the occasional game of French tarot. The rules can be a bit confusing to pick up at first, but they aren't too tricky to get down. Ugh, tricky. Okay, that's another pun I promise was not intended. Like playing chess or Go or Mahjong, it just sometimes feels cool to play a game with a rich history. Like it somehow connects me with the past, even if I know that there are modern twists and lost rules and tons that I don't know about. And yes, modern users do engage in divinatory tactics, but also what Mary Greer and Rachel Pollack described as autopsychotherapy aiming at assisting themselves and others in self-awareness. Both are authors you may want to check out if such modern techniques are of interest to you. Using this meditative approach, one does not even have to harbor any supernatural beliefs. The cards could just be seen as icebreakers, conversation starters, sources of ideas to loosen your inhibitions and get your brain turning with possibilities. Whether one is practicing some occult divination or simply using the cards for a meditative, reflective purpose, there are a myriad of modern practices of varying purposes and levels of complexity available to the reader. I'll go ahead and list a few. None of these are recommendations. This is just kind of a list of different considerations that people who carry out readings today might bear in mind. First, the purpose. Why are you doing this reading? Is this divinatory, meditative? Is it a search for understanding of yourself, of somebody else? Are you looking for guidance? Is it a fun sort of personality quiz? Second, how are you going to set up the reading? Where will you go? When? How will you sit? Where will you place the cards? Are you going to sit in silence? Are you going to listen to music? When you shuffle, how many times? How will you decide when to do this? When to shuffle? When to cut? When to stop and lay out the cards? When it comes to the layout, you've got options. How many cards are you going to use? In what arrangement? There's the standard simple 3-card reading, but you can get more complicated or creative if you want. There's a spread of 3 sets of 3 presenting 2 ideas, and the third set of 3 is the relationship between them. There's a spread of 7 rows of 3 which you may connect in any way you like, such as the Neoplatonic ladder. If you want an astrological reading, create a ring of 12 cards, or if you want to get real fancy, 12 sets of 3 cards, which could enable quite an extensive meditative process. When applying a methodology for your reading, you are essentially engaged in meaning making. You're telling a story with the cards as an impetus for your creative construction. Anything can be a point of inspiration. So, as you survey the cards, let your mind wander. Study single cards as well as the sum of the whole. What stories does your mind weave? Did you read them left to right, right to left? Is there a destination, a starting point? If a figure seems to be facing a certain direction or gesturing some way, what could that mean? Are there pairs of related symbols? Are there opposites? Play with your observations. Finally, when will you conclude? Will you take your first idea, your favorite idea, an idea that occurs to you over and over? Will you try to make meaning from the sum of the spread, or will you take one single card that stands out to you and meditate on that? Will you set aside time afterward or during the process to meditate, reflect, or rest? A lot of mindfulness exercises could apply here if you've looked into mindfulness meditation, giving yourself time to breathe, awareness, sitting in silence. You may want to try to control wandering thoughts, or maybe you want to pretend you're a passive observer watching your thoughts roam free. There's no right or wrong way to engage in this kind of self-reflection any more than there's a right or wrong way to interpret a given card or cards or any piece of art that you encounter. And if someone were to insist that there is a single correct interpretation of a card, I'd really like to see them provide evidence. Can you prove your claim? Can it be tested? Can it be falsified? If not, I'd recommend not clinging too vigorously to your interpretation. Personally, I find the human tendency to make meaning and tell stories infinitely more valuable and fascinating than any individual story one tells. Is tarot an ancient reservoir of occult symbolism and divine knowledge? I would say there are no data that indicate that is the case, but that is one story that humans have told, and it is a fascinating story in its own right. I set out on this project with the goal of learning more about what tarot is and to equip myself with some tactics I could use when looking at decks, questions I could ask, details I could look for, strategies to feel like I'm analyzing the cards at more than a surface level. Here are the results of my investigation. These are my 3 timelines of tarot, which again you can access in a link in the description if you would like. The claim that the tarot is a fount of ancient hidden wisdom is a claim younger than the United States itself. But this historical perspective doesn't have to kill the magic. On the contrary, knowing more about the tarot's origin augments my appreciation for the artifact of multiple times, places, and philosophical concepts. In fact, the 18th century occultists claim that the deck preserves Hermetic truths from ancient Egypt, while a verifiably false claim actually fits perfectly into the tarot's broader history. From its genesis as an assortment of Chinese paper cards to the creation of the Waite-Smith deck, the tarot has been a harbor and harbinger of misinformation and misinterpretation mixed with wonder. The Chinese string suit was thought to be a stick, and so it became one until someone turned it into a magician's wand to suit the interests of later recreators. The image of time and old age transformed from a dark omen into a wise hermit bringing light to dark places. The cursed traitor hanging upside down for a while became a prudent woman evading death. Irony also abounds in the lives of the creators. From de Gébelin to Atea to Lévi to Waite, these studious and educated men insisted the whole world was wrong and wallowing in ignorance that only they could repair. And in so doing, they created something even farther removed from the origin that they believed they alone would restore. Pixie Smith, artist of the world's most popular tarot deck, died in debt and was buried in an unmarked grave after a life of financial difficulty and ceaseless rejections from publishers. Some of these are sad ironies. The story of the tarot, which occultists believed to be esoteric, was ironically hidden from them, but it was not what they believed they'd uncover. And it has been historians' efforts to bring to light that history that banished the esoteric myths the deck accrued. But that historical inquiry likely stemmed from the intrigue that the occultists gave the tarot with their wild, inaccurate claims. They, quote, assumed the right to invent the tarot, as it's put in the history by Decker de Paulus and Dumet. But for all the occultists' decrying of the people's ignorance, they only had access to the Tarot of Marseille, such a thin slice of history, and ignorance of its predecessors. From a thimble full of evidence, they filled an Olympic-sized swimming pool with their inferences and theories. If nothing else, my tarot investigation has taught me a lesson in caution. So many comments from occultists and modern enthusiasts felt akin to that one chart comparing Lincoln and Kennedy. I'm sorry if you've looked at it before. It's only impressive if you don't think about all the careful phrasing, selective examples, and the myriad of dissimilarities that are going ignored. Without some kind of data to point to, I'm more inclined to treat one's insights on numerology, symbolism, and esoteric meanings in the tarot as a product of their own ingenuity, not as something intended by the original artist, certainly not as some eternal truth I need to use to guide my entire life. And the occultists' grand statements from a close inspection of just one case study, just the Tarot of Marseille, have flimsy foundations at best. Acknowledging different orders, different trumps, different suits, and different designs at different times doesn't diminish the magic of the cards by tearing down the occultists' claims. It doesn't take anything away, it reveals more of what they actually are. And what they are is, to me, more beautiful than what others have imagined them to be. I was struck by how often across time and distance people have created ways to conceptualize something beyond this life, from Pythagoras and Plato through the Renaissance rediscovery of mystical texts and innovations adding to them, and through to the modern occultists and analysts. Humans have repeatedly told stories about humans who have reached greater heights through following difficult paths and adhering to philosophical principles. Divine wisdom, it seems, is a pursuit that crosses cultures. The idea that there's some hidden something else out there has had a lot of staying power. I don't think Eliphas Levi was right in his assertion that all cultures have contemplated and commented on the tarot in concealed ways, but I do think he was onto something. It isn't the tarot that's the focus of all cultures, but rather the tarot is one manifestation of a broader focus, whether this be, I don't know, man's search for meaning, for understanding, or for life beyond mortal years. More than anything else, the tarot to me is an artifact of many ages. Every time someone looks at and interprets the tarot, they inevitably reinvent it, turning it into a new artifact of that person's time. The viewer unavoidably adds to the timeline of Renaissance and occultist ideas their own personal personal contexts, putting the artist's creation into conversations with concepts that the artist never encountered. This is that meaning-making that the artist and viewer are always inevitably engaged in, and this means that, as much as we may laugh at the bold, wild claims of older viewers who might have let their enthusiasm sprint ahead of their faculties for a reason, we aren't too different from them. They turn Chinese and Middle Eastern icons into tools of the occultist trade. We've turned their creation into objects of historical inquiry and a game for modern fandoms. It's this endless cycle of seeing an image, interpreting it, and in so doing creating a new iteration of the image that I find so intriguing. The two main texts I used to research this video also serve as two case studies on how one might interrogate the past. A Wicked Deck of Cards by Decker de Paulus and Dumet is a much more skeptical, scathing report of history that tempers fascination with calling historical fouls. If you want a difficult but thoroughly insightful overview, particularly of the occultists, but also with an overview of Renaissance-era ideas at the onset, I would recommend this text. It's not an easy read, but it's an incredibly insightful one. Robert Place's The Tarot, History, Symbolism, and Divination is a peculiar artifact for me. Place somehow manages to impress me with his thorough research and myriad of artistic examples corroborating historical and symbolic interpretations with other contemporaneous works, while simultaneously frustrating me with a total abandon of that evidence-minded caution at times. He can be both ruthlessly skeptical of occultist claims, while also plainly stating something, his own insights or someone else's insights, that makes me beg for footnotes or evidence or some sort of proof commentary. Also strange to me is the weird mix of sloppiness with what is obviously an abundance of care put into this project. Amidst the artistic recreations and the plethora of sources are just so many typos, redundancies that should have been caught in editing, and multiple images that were clearly meant to be one size but that were printed so minusculely that they're functionally useless. In the end, I would recommend his first 4 chapters. They're excellent, with only occasional claims that left me feeling unconvinced or wanting more proof. But the latter chapters abandon history and argue for deep esoteric symbolism in cards and their practical application for modern divinatory practice. I do think that's useful as a lens into the 21st century meditative and divinatory use of the modern tarot, but it lacks the rigor that was present in the onset of the book. But I don't want to tell you how to read or not read your tarots or your histories. These are my impressions. When I look at tarot decks in the future, I'm going to be looking at them with a better eye than I have in the past. Personally, I will first want to look at the Major Arcana. What sequence do they use? What triumphal story do they seem to be telling? Which virtues do they use in particular? Do they include the missing cardinal virtue, prudence? Do they include the Christian virtues? Do they include other unique things like the elements or the zodiac? Do they depart from the standard in the Marseille and the Waite-Smith decks to include gods like the Solabusca? What symbols are there? Are they astrological, alchemical, Kabbalistic, Neoplatonic, Egyptian-ish in nature? If it's a themed deck, there are lots of those today, recreations inspired by fiction or other mythologies, how do they adapt the structure of the Waite-Smith deck and its symbolism to fit the new theme? Which individual cards capture my interest? Which patterns across cards do I detect? Recurring characters, symbols, ideas, a possible interaction from how one figure looks at or gestures toward another card? Looking beyond the deck itself, there are more questions you could ask. When was it made? Who made it? What contextual factors might the artist have considered at the time they were constructing the deck? What did they bring to the table to put into conversation with all of these other ideas that we've discussed here? I may not have all the answers while looking at the deck. Correction, there's no way I'd have all the answers to these questions, but I would feel more equipped to go into an analysis with plenty of questions. To me, that's just as, if not more, valuable. I hope these ideas haven't demystified the tarot for you. Rather, I hope that this investigation has, like it did for me, increased your appreciation of this artifact, with more than a millennium of human ingenuity behind it.